he's got a really good point.
Good morning, gentlemen. David and John and I are together again. I believe this is our third conversation, and we had a little prelude to this conversation to look at the focus of this discussion, which is to look at what we do to instigate, to impose and induce obsessive thinking and make believe that all we can do is what we think and all we are is what we think. And as a result, we have no other choice than to suffer the indignation that we create in our thinking and look for all the different ways to feel better about it, when in fact, all those different ways that give us an impression that we're feeling better about something that's wrong only helps us get better at acting wrong in the name of feeling better. And feeling is an effect of a cause. Thoughts cause feelings. If there's no thought, we typically don't think much about something. And the seeming power of those thoughts gives us an incredible impression that it's all that's happening when it's conflicted. The inner turmoil and the inner conflict and the emotional turmoil and all those senses of being out of control or desperately needing control, which is the same thing. If we're out of control and think we need control, we have to work very hard at making sure that everything goes according to the way we think it should, because we think when we take actions and make decisions, we think the only thing that should happen is what we think, never anything else. So when we're to micromanage all the little details that might veer from what we thought is to show how critically we think our thinking is, when in fact the critical observation is to recognize that our thinking is never truth in reality. It's simply a conclusion we're making on the limited information we have that's a best estimate, a best guess, and an assessment that we can certainly use to make decisions to help promote our survival. But when those decisions begin to threaten our survival, we become the greatest enemy we could possibly ever witness in our own experience. And that becoming is the thing we think we are by what we think about who we think we are. It is the thinking about the thinking, and thinking of itself gives us this impression. When I think of my arm or my leg or my head, I don't think I become an arm and a leg or a head. But when I think about my thinking, all of a sudden I miraculously seem to become what I think. It's very interesting. And I would imagine the distinction is that thinking about thinking is redundant, where thinking about my arm is at least distinct to thinking about something that isn't my thinking. So thinking about my thinking tends to create this sort of parade of thoughts that just circulate and circulate and circulate. And that vicious cycle can be very, very difficult to live with when it seems like it's happening to us rather than being created and caused by us. That's my prelude.
I think I finally got that expression you used about thinking about the arm and then becoming what you're thinking. You know, and it finally just hit home, I guess, because of the conversation we had prior to this. You know, but it's fine. I like boing. Oh yeah, wow. That's
yeah. It's like thinking with your dick.
Yeah.
Well, I would say there's not a lot of thinking there.
Yeah.
You never know. Yeah. Speak for yourself.
Yeah. Yeah. So, but yeah, it just hit home.
So the ability we have, and David, to that point, which I think is worth noting, is if we have a knowing nature, the awakening isn't doing something new, except for the fact that we're always in the new moment. We're always present in a moment that's new. We're always here now. It's always new. What does that mean? All possibility is possible. And certainly it would be possible to start conceding that what's actually happening is happening. And those little pops, when you go, oh, it's not a being told. It's not what I said. It's your own awareness and your own willingness to say, oh, I see how that fits, because you know it. It's not because of what I say. And yet, if what we say to each other doesn't really reflect what's happening, all we're doing is confusing each other's experience the same way we confuse our own inner experience by making believe who we are is what we think, and all that should ever happen is what we thought would happen when we originally made the decision, and that we're offended by people because they don't think like we do, and not notice that that's just a defensive posture because we're defending thoughts that aren't true. And we would naturally be offended by people who don't think that way if we think it's reality and truth, because we think our life would be threatened by that thinking. Very different approach to starting to actually witness what we're doing rather than make believe it's who we are and what we are and need to explain to everybody for the next 30 years in stories that go on and on and on that are never going to tell the truth, because the truth is already true. It doesn't need to be told because it speaks for itself by being ever present. Truth isn't sitting back saying, let me tell you the story of humanity and then you can believe in me. It's just an ever-present state of being. It doesn't come or go. It isn't more or less. It isn't something that's quantifiable in the thinking process that we do. So talking about it in human terms is to begin to take the leash off of what we might think we're on the leash of, which is the contempt and the minimization and the depreciation and all the conflicts that we tend to create and make believe that they're happening to us rather than actually being caused by us. That transition of thought is very freeing, because all of a sudden, if I know that I'm creating the experience, all of a sudden I start looking at the experience and say, why would I want to do this if I weren't crazy? And I can say, because you're crazy to keep doing it. It's easier to start seeing it that way than think of it as something that's a stigmatization of mental illness or a lack of health mentally.
Yeah, I just see it as us going into an arena. And when our first conversation, our first dialogue, we had a lot of weapons on the wall, all of us. And each time, like this is the third one, and now it's like the walls are pretty much bare. And with the realization of what we're sitting down talking about, even but like, and with John and some of the things that he's saying, I've noticed a slight shift, because we've becoming aware, like he said, we had something special to share, and we have, and going through these things and talking about them and sitting down and like the weeks in between, I think we've learned a lot, about each other, especially in this arena, because it was kind of a knockdown, drag out for a little while. And now I think there's this peace, this serene peace that we're coming back to, that we should have started with, and we did, to be honest. But I think the waves were kind of big, and but now I think things are becoming more serene, especially for me. I'm gonna speak for myself. For me, to say, you know what, I digging up some of these things that have been troubling me in my heart and has been stagnating my progress, and then talking about these things and coming out, it's like I have been reaching some success lately. And I credit that to opening up my mind and my spirit, being vulnerable and talking, because the thing that I haven't been, it's like I've been standing here with my fist balled up. John knows where I'm coming from with that one right there. And it's just like, I'm ready for the bell to ring. And regardless of what it is, I'm gonna swing on it, and I just say that in those terms, just because I, understanding, and with John, but with Jack, being a referee and Jack socking the shit out of both of us at the same time, and it was hard to understand, because everything that was coming was justified. And that's the hardest thing to accept, is the things that are justified, even in the sense of telling the story, that John has a lot to say. I mean, look who he's become. But one thing about John is a ferocious competitor. You go to the brink of like, I'm gonna kick you so goddamn hard that you're gonna say, I wish I was dead, and that's why I'm gonna tap out, because I didn't think I would be that close to death. But that pain that I've just felt, and we know how to administer that, But going into this conversation, I just wanted to say that I found I found peace. Even going back and reading my own words, it's like, damn, I was already there. But you guys have reminded me and brought me back to a different state of presence.
Well, and David, I know, John, you're going to have thoughts about David, and I want to give you that time, but I want to address a couple of points. That idea that we have that we leave that place because we become engulfed in the thinking we're doing isn't true. It isn't true that our mind and our spirit is coming around. It's only true that the thinking we're doing that we think is real and true is causing an impact to give us the impression that our mind and spirit are somehow impaired. It isn't our mind and spirit. It's what we're thinking in a brain that's built into a body.
Yeah.
Right? So
Yes.
the distinction of that is beginning to see that you can never leave a place that's absolute, and you can never get to a place that's absolute, because it's always the place we're in to even think we're not there. If we can think we're not there, we must be there thinking it, right? So the thing we're trying to claim is conflicted with the actual presence of our thinking. And it starts to, the fact is, we don't talk about it openly enough to speak of it in terms that are accurate enough to start to isolate what the problem is. And the problem is always coming from what we think is truth and reality, rather than a problem with truth or reality. It's what we're thinking about our nature rather than our nature. If our nature is essence, if we have any essence in our nature, it's essential. It's not an option, and it's not a negotiation. It's not something we can have more or less of. It's something we always have. So the love part, as you said, is exactly where we started, because it's what starts every moment. It is the nature of where we are now, and the nature of this conversation is to begin to at least notice that, and notice that what we do ultimately for everyone and what we struggle with is our own ability to either express that love or not express that love in the clarity that we're capable of. And my sense is we mourn and grieve over not doing that, and then use death and all kinds of other experience, loss and all kinds of other situations to justify it, rather than concede it's happening as a result of our own. We are so heartsick and so heartbroken, and those are obviously words that suggest the heart is broken when it's not broken to be beating so that I can continue to talk about it. But they're words, concepts that we use to make points. And if I'm mourning and feel loss and feel grief, there's a good chance that what I'm really missing is thinking about things accurately, rather than thinking I'm actually missing the moment. All I'm missing in the moment is what I'm thinking, because I'm not thinking clearly, and I'm not thinking accurately, and I'm not thinking transparently, and I'm not thinking honestly. All I'm losing is a thought experience that could be whole and complete and an absolute expression of the functional human capacity we all share, rather than one divided and set to try and conquer other thoughts. Just because I can argue against them must mean I must be arguing within my own thinking too. It means that enemy that I think is out there, that everybody else poses as, is actually the one I'm facing in my own ideas about who I think I am. And to begin to get that, as you described 20 minutes ago while we were talking, is to begin to have compassion for people that are struggling with it, rather than see them as spiteful, pitiful creatures they're toxic and I don't want anything to do with them. What better way to make believe that we aren't doing that to ourselves than think there's somebody else we need to stay away from, when it's the toxicity of our own thinking that we're admitting we don't want to face?
No.
Mr. P?
Well, on his note, which I take copious notes. I don't know him, right? Because I haven't seen his teeth, right? But I know me, and I'm attracted to violence. I'm created, some say, the most violent sport ever, and I've been focused on that a big part of my life. I don't think I should be cubbyholed into being a police officer, because I've only been a police officer for 4 years. But my paintings, are about moments of violence. My writing has, sex and violence. So my question and this is I think my first question to David. If you want me to ask the question first, if you want me just to focus on you for a second, I'll do that. But so I don't really know him, and I don't know what you guys are talking about in terms of like some moment in time where he got pissed off. I don't know what you're talking about, so I have no basis for judgment on that. But the phone is not a good way to see teeth, because people text tough and people talk on the phone tough. I'm not accusing him of that. What I'm saying is that there's an insulation to the phone line, or this, whatever this thing is, this Zoom line, that prevents me from really getting a handle on somebody. And we've had some real pretty intimate conversations, which I think are great. But there's a difference between looking in someone's eyes. For me, there's a difference between me looking into someone's eyes and talking on the phone.
Okay, so you think there's a distinction. Now, I would suggest to you that when you say you don't know because you haven't seen his teeth, that would mean to suggest that knowledge is based in violence. And
a big part of that's right. A big part of my knowledge of someone,
yes,
is based in the gravest extreme.
Yes,
that is correct.
So it's another indication that we think thinking is the source of being. We think thinking, what's violent in thinking is an interminable conflict in our own experience that creates present traumatic stress 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 days a year for decades.
Yes.
It is the source of violence.
I'm not negating any of that.
Well, and I'm addressing it in the sense that it's literally a thought-produced consequence. And the reason it's violent is that it's trying to represent itself as pain and disease. Because what comes with violence but pain? And what comes with making believe our bodies don't heal naturally but disease? It's the same byproduct. And what does disease come with? Pain. What is pain? It isn't evidence of reality and truth, but it's evidence of something wrong, period.
This is just me being honest.
I get
David,
it.
what do you think about what I said?
David's frozen. There he is.
Do you hear me?
Yeah,
Good guy. Did you hear me?
I can hear you. I froze for a second, but I had to plug up my iPad.
Did you hear what I said?
Freezing again. I didn't just now. If you said something, no. Why all of a sudden it's tripping?
You might want to turn off your video, David. If you turn off your video, it might improve the sound. But tell me if that helps.
Yeah, it seems to be helping. I can hear you now.
So did you hear that I said that I don't know you because I haven't seen your
I heard
teeth?
that part. Yes.
So what do you think about that?
I understand. One of the things I was taught is that you show your true self when you're angry. And I'm taking that's what you mean by that. 100% honest when you're angry because you don't give a fuck what nobody feels. So and I understand where you're coming with that, and especially in the thought process that I feel we share.
Yeah. So everybody's methodologies for violence are different, and I'm curious about your methodologies for violence because I've always been. You hear me? Dave, can you hear me? He's gone. Jack.
Yeah, he may be back. So let me make a point to you, John, and it follows on David's, that anger represents our true self, that you really know somebody. That doesn't. That self that we're imagining ourself to be is the self born in thought that isn't who we are. And it's born in fear. It's born in anger. It's born in violence because it has no place, and its only existence is to fight. Its only existence in our thinking is to have us constantly think about it, which is what self-centered thinking is, thinking of itself, thinking of me, pitting myself against all others and all things in the name of making believe that someday, the more I rely on this thinking of self, the closer I'll get to truth. And it's interminably impossible to live that way. David?
And difficult.
Well, it's impossible. So there's no.
Yeah, because it's a full-time job trying to sustain that.
Exactly. So David, are you listening? We're not hearing you.
I don't know why.
There you are. There you are. That might be better.
Yeah, because I can hear you now, Jack.
Okay. So I was saying to John, when your true self left, you said that the true self is found in anger. The fact is, this self we think we are is born in fear because all it is thought thinking about thought. And we turn it in, because thought can think of itself, we turn it into the self of who we are. It is not who we are. And there is no greater antagonism we can place on our experience than to make believe that fantasy is reality, because we begin to dabble in insanity and make believe our life is true and insane at the same time. That's where the violence comes from. A self born in thought, if it were true, would not be born out of fear. It would not cause the internal grind. It would not have us think we always needed more and needed to be somewhere else. None of those things would be byproducts, because we would be fulfilled by the nature of having accomplished what's possible and what we are naturally doing. It isn't who we are. So this true self getting angry is built in anger. It's built in fear. It has nothing other than our constant thinking about it, which is what obsessive thinking is, which is why it's the primary addiction to all reactive, impulsive, and compulsive behaviors. Think of the reactiveness that leads to those violent outbursts, right? They're little bits. We think we're going to hold it back. We think we're going to hold ourselves back. We think we're going to pull back. We're going to pull the reins. We're going to hold things in check. And all of a sudden it explodes, and we can't seem to do that. It's because we're denying what we're creating and living with it in ways that are absolutely driving us crazy. And they're not driving us because we're always where we are, so we don't need to be driven there. There's no place to get because we're already having the experience exactly where we are. And to be consumed by that and make believe that's true and then launch off and more thinking about it to try to straighten it out is just another story about what's wrong that isn't wrong, because we're thinking about it we're thinking we can use more thought to resolve what thought is creating to begin with. So to add more thought to it, thinking about thinking creates more thought. It does not create us. It does not create our true self. It doesn't create a self at all. It just creates more thinking. To think that's our source is to be so preoccupied that we think that truth and reality come and go because we don't experience them. And when we don't, we think because we're not feeling them, because we're feeling the thinking we're doing and the obsessions we're doing and the upset and the fear and the anxiety and the stress and the doubt and the uncertainty, we're consumed by it, literally intoxicated by it. And our body now is on a ready alert, releasing and wearing our body out with chemicals that are designed for emergencies, not for 24 hours, 7 days a week, for years and years and years and end, wondering why our bodies fail and we feel exhausted. Very natural. It's a natural consequence to an action that we make believe we think it's happening to us. which is one other way, again, of thinking I have nothing to do with it. So how can I stop? If it's happening to me, I can't stop it. So what am I, a victim? While in fact, I'm the cause. I'm irresponsible in my actions, while in fact, I'm responsible for those actions. That self of our source, our soul, whatever that might be called, isn't born in fear at all. Doesn't even know fear. There is no such thing as fear. Doesn't exist in love. Hate doesn't exist in love. In absolute terms, there are none of those other things that we concoct and induce and impose. Chronic impositions become depressing after time. Why? Because we're wearing a weight we're creating by resisting what we're doing as though we're not doing it. And it builds and it builds and it builds. What does it build? Stress. What is stress an indication of? Bearing a weight. What's the weight? The pressure created by resisting what's happening. It's not real, but our body manifests things as a result. Our body is we are manifestors by nature. We are creators by nature. And to create things that kill us and kill others is probably not the highest utilization of that capacity. And that's why I would call this a sickness and a disease and the core issue of addiction, which is not suffered only by people who have overt compulsions, but suffered by anyone entertaining thoughts that aren't true as true right now. It's all the seeded field, regardless of what's grown from that field, is shared by everyone who does any of that at any time. And I would suggest we're probably all doing that to some degree all the time. In terms of our thinking, not in terms of reality, not in terms of truth. Circumstances and consequences become mirrors of that. So we think we're justified in the feelings we're having because we create the problems to go along with them. There's another form of manifestation. How things are right now is exactly the way we want them to be, worldwide, universally, etc. Because if we didn't, we'd be doing something else. We'd have them some other way. And yet, here they are as they are. There's no other way they can be right now but as they are. And to not talk about it that way is to think of it in terms only according to thinking rather than actuality, factuality, and what we call reality, which is, I would say, if it's circumstance, it's not quite real, but it's as close as we get in this physical construct, this portal in the present that seems not to be based in time because it's always beginning, it's always new, it has no end. So it isn't on a continuum. It's this absolute witness of the spiritual nature of our existence, whatever that spirit means, whatever that source is. If it is absolutely absolute where we are as we are now.
Yeah. You guys kept freezing. I was hearing it, but it was like I could catch every bit of it. There's a question I wanted to ask. One of the things I wanted to think, I was thinking about as far as like the way you seen things as a facade or a necessity, the way that freezing again.
David, we're losing you again.
Yeah, I don't know what's killing my connection right now. It just all of a sudden started killing. Damn.
Do you have I'm going to stop the recording really quick.
Can you hear me?
I'm going to stop the recording real quick. So David, you were going to ask John a question now that you're a little better connected.
Yeah, exactly. One of the things I was going to ask him, based on, the lifestyle that he lived or whatnot, what did you feel that lifestyle was a facade or was it a necessity in who you were?
Yeah, self-preservation caused that to be a necessity. I grew up in this incredibly abusive household with my Goliath father. And it was the only way that I thought that I could outdo Goliath. was to become, in essence, the goal was to be the best fighter in the world, even if I had to create two sports to do it. But with that came this sadistic, predatorial personality. Even though I might show you deer in the headlights and do all my training backwards, I'm going to lash out and catch you off guard. And because of the scale of my father, who in the end was probably like 6'2", 260, and a fearless man. I could never outdo him in that sense, but I could become someone who was someone to be reckoned with. And that constant state of arousal and defensiveness caused this personality to be incredibly intense and edgy, and still is.
Yeah. And that's our
It's a
discussion.
full-time job.
Well, it's a full-time job you choose to full-time attend to. And the idea that that isn't an addiction is to overlook that addiction always thinks it's not doing what it's doing. People who are drinking don't think of it as a problem typically. They think of it as a solution. If they're drinking to a point of absurdity within addiction or compulsion. Most people that compulsions are generally perpetuated by thinking they're not having any effect, by thinking they're saving us rather than condemning us. And think of self-preservation. It's literally an you're embalming, trying to preserve the body of an idea that you think is who you are, a self born in thought. What is that? An idea. You're embalming it, just like a funeral director would to try to have the body look better for burial.
Yeah, it's a belief in concept.
It has no life at all. And to
Well, you give it life.
think about that though. If life is all and complete and whole, you can't give it life. You can think you give it life, and you can think your life depends on what you gave it by maintaining it with all those things you just described, the defensiveness and that sort of corrosive, interactive, poisonous tendency toward others. It's not a coincidence. It's an absolute consequence. It's a perfect mirror image of our internal fight that we can't win. Because we're both digging the grave and throwing the dirt over our shoulders back into the grave. And we take another scoop and throw it right back into the grave and wonder why we just can't seem to get anywhere.
So I have a question for you, David.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. Can you hear me?
So how long, time-wise, did it take for you to decide to react like you did when you got in trouble with your brother?
Say it to me one more time so I can get it.
How long did it take, time-wise? Did it take for you to decide to react like you did when you got in trouble with your brother?
You know what? When I seen the person, it was a flicker. You know, it wasn't no thought. I just knew. It was, you know, and it's crazy that you asked me that, because my next question was, what do you consider valuable from your reactions? You know, and dealing on the how you react to situations. But for me, you know, I just knew. Yeah, at that time, you know, just it's been ingrained in me from community standards, you know, that's what I had to do. But I didn't have any fear in what it was I was about to do. And that's the reason why it turned out so bad.
Because there's so many people that have been asked that question, men, to your point about women before, men, well, actually, we weren't on the air, so no one knows what the fuck I'm talking about. But men reacting in a split second in the most violent way. So there's no thinking involved.
No.
Well, don't imagine if we can think we're not doing what we're doing right now, and we think all that's happening is what we're thinking, and we think everything beyond what's happening, everything else that's actually happening isn't happening because we're not thinking about it. Think of how delusionally capable we are of making believe that we don't even feel what's happening. And we're using numbness to say we're not even thinking about it. David, you said it takes no thought at all. Well, intuition doesn't take thinking at all. So there would be something that sort of mimics this self-imposed experience seems to mimic the relation or the reality of reality, which is an all-knowing knowing. If we already know everything, it's what we're thinking we know we're struggling with. It's what we're thinking about that we're struggling with. It isn't, and we'll speak about it in terms that will create a narrative to give us the impression that we don't know what's happening and we're not thinking and all that, when in fact, no action that's ever been taken that's voluntary.
I think we talked before, Jack, me and you, when I said we crossed that line.
Yeah.
And then we think we're stepping back over, and then we cross that line again. And as we cross that line every time, we think we're taking one step back and we're back over here in insanity. But when we keep crossing, we go so far deep into that, that's what the world is for us. That's our reality. So when I'm saying it didn't take no thought, it's because it's what I was living in.
Yes.
You know,
well, but that reality is insanity. And we use those narratives to justify that we have no other choice. It's the only thing I can do because that became my reality. Well, to imagine that reality can't be any less than everything that there is. So it doesn't need us to augment it. We only make those stories up to try to give weight to what we're doing when the weight that we're doing it with is in fact the depression and the anxiety and the stress that we're maintaining, because it creates this apparency of pressure and desperation. And what do we do with desperation? Act more desperately. Mm-hmm. And what do we do with more desperate thoughts? Create more circumstances to pretty soon go seemingly blind to what we're doing.
True.
We call it ingrained, habit, impossible to stop. When in fact,
ingrained is the best word I would use. It was ingrained in me. It's like, because one of the other questions I was going to ask John was, how do you see beatings versus spankings? Because these are the things. How do you see the difference between beatings versus spankings? Because of your past with your father, there's a lot of children got spankings, but then you got beatings. How do you correlate that? I mean, how do you bring, I don't even know what word I'm trying to say now, but, I'm getting caught in the moment.
Can I offer you a thought?
Sure.
We grow up trying to make sense out of insanity. Do you know what happens to people that try to make sense out of insanity? They go insane trying.
Yeah, and get beat.
Well, we start beating ourselves for the thing we're actually beating the self we think we are on the basis of thinking if we can just figure out why somebody who said they loved us would treat us that way. When in fact, it shouldn't make sense to us because there was no sense made to do it. It was all coming out of this same insane thing. We're repeating the cycle in the present, making believe we'll figure out the past, while in fact we're doing in the present exactly what happened in the past, trying to avoid culpability for what we're doing now by thinking about it as something that isn't happening and already happened. And we can't seem to, the pain that we suffered is being maintained in the present trauma we're creating by making believe it's not what we're doing now with what happened then. And that's where this whole issue of the story comes up, where I want to poke and probe at the stories rather than hope someday your story will be sufficient for you to feel okay. Because I know what it's doing is creating a narrative for you to justify that what you're doing is all based on something that's no longer happening. when in fact all it's based on is you're thinking about what isn't happening in the present that's causing the traumatic stress that you're suffering.
So in answer to your query is that, well, my father, besides putting his hands on me and his feet, he also had his big hunting belt, which was like a 3-inch heavy leather belt. And, he would have my mother go get the belt, quote unquote. And you have to understand how small a person I was. I was a tiny kid. And, there was no reason to have an implement in his hand. It's insanity, like Jack said, but here, I'll tell you a quick story and the difference between the spanking and the beating. So I think I was like 16 years old, and I was up in Pennsylvania at my uncle's ranch. He raised cutting horses and later on raised trotters. And in Milford, Pennsylvania. And my father was up there, and my cousin, and he had these beautiful giant barns, brand new barns. And my cousin was on a forklift, and he got entangled in the eaves, the overhangs with the forklift. He got stuck in there with it, like because he was taking hay or something out of the barn. But he got his fork stuck in there, and he was trying to get the forklift out of there. He was breaking the eaves, the wooden building. He was breaking it, and I was like, Billy, get the fuck off there. Let me have it. And I jumped up on there and tried to get this thing extracted from the eaves. And my father caught me doing that. And he's screaming and yelling at me. And I'm like, no, it's not me. And then I have to jump off the forklift. And then he chased me. And I jumped into the pond and swam across the pond to get away from him. And he chased me around the pond, and then I ran over to the cabin, which was this small little cabin, right? And he picked up a pickaxe and threw it at me, like sideways, like a frisbee kind of, but forehand, like in like tennis. And he threw this pickaxe at me, and it went, like woo, woo, woo. And I ducked down onto the ground, and it went right through the bay window. And that's it. That's it right there. That's the difference right there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
How long ago?
I mean, he would have taken my head right off.
How long ago did that happen?
16. I was 16 years old.
And you can probably feel ready to take other people's heads off presently in the moment.
Huh?
Can't you feel, and haven't you felt since then, like taking other people's heads off in that same sort of way? And maybe have in terms of circumstance?
I don't know what he felt, Jack.
I'm not asking about that. I'm asking about you. Haven't you had that same experience of wanting to take somebody's head off, or having something you did that you didn't think would happen the way you thought it would happen end up happening in a way that just about hurt somebody in a way that would have been very hard to repair?
Oh yeah, people have suffered at my hands.
Yeah. Okay. So
absolutely.
If we're here talking about this and we're in the present, the healing isn't something missing, but the antagonism to our own experience is being reinforced by maintaining the story as though it's what's the problem rather than what we're making of it in the present. What happened?
So me describing the problem as an illustration of the question, the answer to the question that he asked.
The present ideas we're having about reality and truth. And we even in this conversation have referred to them as reality and truth. It's the present ideas we're struggling with. And the healing, the potential relief of that trauma is certainly not made possible by continuing to reinforce it as something that happened at a time that's no longer happening, but actually beginning to recognize that all we've ever done with the stories is keep telling them in the present, making believe somehow or another we'd make sense out of something that never made any sense. And now we're imposing the same trauma that we witnessed back then at levels well beyond the memory of the story, because the stories tend to be visual representations and narratives. I can see the pond, I can see the barn, I can see the forklift, I can see your father throwing something, I can see you ducking. I'm not seeing the interior landscape of all that. But that's what we have to talk about here, is start to say, oh, if all I've done has been telling these stories to reinforce the idea my problem is as a result of those things, then I haven't gotten very good at noticing that my problem is what I'm thinking about them now. And if what I'm thinking about them now, when they're not happening, is insane to think they're still happening, and the cause of my present, it's my current insanity that's reinforcing these ideas, that's causing the trauma, the present trauma, to continue to feel as though it's attached to that thing back then, where I have no possibility of ever fixing it because it's in a place that doesn't even exist, just like it's happening to a self that only exists in the thinking I'm doing about my thinking. It's just another imposition of imposition of imposition of imposition in a present experience.
And
So
I don't even know if I answered your question, David.
Oh, you did. One of the notes that I wrote down, like I was saying, I went back into my book of notes, especially when I was working with the kids at the schools. And I said, one of the things I said, the only fear I've had was not being able to research the truth, to find the true freedoms within ourselves, and basically that's one of the reasons why I asked the question, is to research the truth. And what the truth is, as you have a definition for it, Jack, the truth just is, and
there's no research involved in that.
Yeah. But as far as, when I was talking about how we've crossed that line so many times that so many other people are afraid to cross. We didn't only cross the line, we went and lived in the mountains in that motherfucking world, and that only research is to find what the truth really is to us today, as you state.
But that's not true, David. That's it's just a new culmination of thought deciding that you're the creator of truth and reality.
No, I'm not the creator of truth. God is,
So when you just said it's a new truth or your new arrival, it's again relying on thought to be the determinant of truth, which is an absolute conflict with reality, which is fantasy. Mm. And part of the probing I do, and part of the needling I do, is to start to look at the words we use that continue to develop these narratives that give us these images that seem real and true because they look like they're real and true in the thinking we do, but all they are is us standing in a mirror with a mask on we want to make believe we're not wearing because we don't like how we look.
Yeah, and I'm also probing and needling him also.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, and that's all it was is to bring forth these thoughts, that, just like you admitted when you were saying something, it was because it's what I was thinking, and his thought and his thinking and the way where he's at, I can see it. I can see him clearly, but to bring it forth and to be acceptable to you is a hard thing to do.
No. It's not a matter of it being acceptable to me. It's just a matter of talking about it accurately enough to actually be seen as something we're all doing rather than something I'm talking about exclusive to what you're doing. Mm-hmm. It's beginning to actually shift and notice how committed we are to the stories. And we keep looping back even after I talk about the present state of awareness where there is no story, there is no narrative. We loop back to what's the answer to the question about the story? What's the answer to the question about how are we going to get the story figured out? Nothing wrong with that.
And I agree with you, to a certain extent, and it's just like, I have a game plan. And I write it in the sand and you come in and you so the game plan is a little skewed now. Yeah. Because some of the things you say they make valid sense. But also what I'm trying to do is it's like with a fish. You throw a line in there, it's not just going to jump in the boat. You got to reel it in. And that's exactly what I'm doing. I'm fishing some of these emotions that he has deep because, like I was saying before, you two have really brought out something inside of me to make me look at it. And right now I'm trying, it's also a healing process for John. And one of the reasons he chose us and me, I would say, is because he knows I can be in touch with it. And I am in touch with it.
Definitely.
Well, and when it comes to reality, we can't be out of touch with it.
And
it isn't a touch, it's just a present knowing nature. And the shift again, and David, when you start having those little epiphanies, and I went through this and I go through this on a daily basis to some degree, when I have those epiphanies of clarity, I kind of feel that things are resolved. And yet what it gives me clarity of is the stuff I'm still doing that isn't resolved. And so what I think I need to do with that stuff is think more about it rather than see that the actual freedom is that absolute awareness that I've given myself concession to actually begin to admit exists, and stop thinking more thinking is going to solve it, when all of a sudden all that happens is when I see the clarity, the desperate thoughts become more obvious. So to rely on them as the source now to become the thinker again is to just create a new web, a new cycle of this thinking about thinking in what seems like a new way, but it's doing the same old thing because it's kind of repeating this idea that thinking will be the concluder. When I finally think right, I'll finally be right, rather than see that I already know what's right. And the question is, why don't I just express that and allow my thoughts to do what they're designed to do, which is to express what's right naturally. They don't need my thinking about them to do that, because intuition is knowledge beyond reason. It just happens. You said it earlier, even some of your actions, you didn't even think, you didn't have a thought. You just knew what to do. Even within the confines of our thinking, we can become so fixated. Love doesn't seem to do that as quickly as violence. When we lose all different perspectives, love seems to threaten us. Like love's probably the environment that we say, I don't know what the hell to do. Because it's so broad and it's so encompassing, and it's so easy to do things that aren't loving, and so easy to think things that aren't generous and aren't abundant, given the history of our doing, only trying to reinforce those scarce ideas.
So I have a question, David. So can you describe for me the emotional trigger in you?
I don't know if I know how to pinpoint that in an expression. It's the feeling that at one point in time, I grabbed my mother and told her to keep her hands off me. And even my father, one time he went to hit me, and I locked myself in the bathroom. And the thing I told him, I said, it's too late. It's too late for you to try to fix this. I'm here. And I tell a story about when I used to pump gas when I was 10 years old, sneak outside. 10 years old. I sneak outside with my brother who was 11, and we would pump gas because we were tired of being hungry. And my mom, deep in her depression and in her pride, wouldn't get up and ask, people in the family, hey, I need money to feed my children. So I took it upon myself. And so that trigger has come from not being heard, and then when it's coming time for me to say I want to be heard, I got beat for it, to the point where I say, you know what? I'm going to fight you back now. I got my ass whooped by my dad, because when he finally he cocked his hand back, I socked him, and he beat the shit out of me for it. And then my mom.
How old were you?
At that time, I was about 12.
Wow.
Yeah.
Man, I didn't do that till I was 16.
Yeah. And I ran to my grandmother for help. And once she seen that, she didn't yell at me. She just told me to come in and sit down. And then she talked to my dad. That's the first time I ever seen her react that way. But she knew herself. And even with my mom, when I told her stop hitting me, I'm like, you don't have to beat me to get me to understand where you're coming from. But the reason you're beating me is because I'm not doing your job. And then when I finally got incarcerated, everybody was happy. They were really happy, and then she told me, she said, if you ever get incarcerated again, I'm not going to be there for you. And I ended up going back for some shit that I didn't do, but she kept her word. And it was like, why am I the only one of your children you kept your word to where you showed me your absence? And so I said, I never really had a relationship with my mother and father as mother and father. They were always my friends, or, so that's my emotional trigger right there, because I didn't know how to feel that, So, and it led me to make a lot of bad choices in my life, and then especially with people close to me, it was hard for me to learn how to love or to hold things, but I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, no, it's perfect.
Yeah.
So guys, there's nothing wrong with stories. I don't say what I say to tell you that you shouldn't tell stories and shouldn't think of things that happened. It's the transition of making believe that there's somewhere else rather than what we're doing with them now that causes the trauma. Because if there's somewhere else that we can never get, how desperate to want to fix something and learn from something that we can't even find.
Yeah.
Can't have any basis to. And it's always what we're doing presently with them that's creating the impact. So the question is, what I look at when I'm disturbed is I know I'm having thoughts that I think are true and real, that aren't true and real. Because if they were truth and reality, I would not be struggling with them. I would be expressing them fully and be fulfilled by that expression. I wouldn't be conflicted. I wouldn't be wondering what to do. I wouldn't be in doubt. I wouldn't have uncertainty. I wouldn't be trying to feel better all the time and to get some other place where it'll finally be okay when I arrive. Those things wouldn't happen if it was in fact real and true, because there's no greater fulfillment than reality and truth. And love is effectively what those would be. Love is generous, supportive, always present, always giving everything, not some things, all of it. Incomprehensible within the thinking that's rationalized and justified and reasonable and logical when it comes to what we think is true and what we think is real. It's just a shift from that. Why? Because we're not stuck in it. We're creating the idea of being stuck so we can continue to make believe there's nothing we can do, so we can continue to do the thing that's causing it and claim we're not responsible for it, while we're directly doing the exact same thing we want to claim to be irresponsible for. And you can see that conflict. If we're responsible, acting like we're not responsible, that is a major conflict of our own capacity to express ourselves in a meaningful, purposeful, useful way as humans. Major conflict. Just as thinking we're not where we are. If we're not where we are, well, we're always where we are, and thinking we shouldn't be here, think of that conflict. Most of the thinking that goes on with this ego self that we call who we are is always based in the past and the future, never in the present, because there's no place for it in the present. All it is a concept of a past and a concept of a future. And to create a future based on what we think is true and real that reflects that past that we consistently think is true and real is to create a future that ends up proving, we try to use it to prove that our past was in fact real and true, and we're condemned only to the future that we've created, rather than see we've actually used it as a justification to try to prove what we were thinking was true and real, to end up in a situation that reflects it perfectly. Diminished capacity, failure in relationships. In AA, it's called the bedevilments. Inability to have gainful relationships, not able to take care of ourselves financially, prey to misery and depression. All that kind of stuff are natural byproducts of that thinking.
Yes. And I believe that.
Yeah. So our discussion, as we
can... Oh, go ahead, Jack.
What's that?
Oh, no, I stepped on you. Go ahead.
Our discussion is not so much not to do what we're doing, but really begin to say, oh, if all I'm ever doing is all I'm ever doing, and what I'm doing is what I'm doing, it might be worth noticing what I'm doing while I'm doing it and start to acknowledge it, it isn't a matter of being right or wrong in it. If wrong is wrong and we're wrong, if we're right about what's wrong, letting it be wrong, there's no conflict in that. Then we can actually look at what's wrong and say, do I want to continue doing this, rather than feel condemned to repeat it as the only thing I can do. That's what addiction is. That transition is thinking, I can't do anything else. And why does this keep happening? And I just have this dismal view of the world, and everybody seems to live up to my worst expectations all the time. And all I have is ample proof of what's wrong in the world. Well, I can't seem to get to the point where I actually come to terms with what's wrong in what I'm doing now.
So I have another question. So when you went to juvie jail, did you walk in as top dog?
No. No, I walked in fearful for not knowing what my surroundings were, what was coming next. I was actually afraid. Afraid of being, I guess you could say, first time away from home like that. And then being around, older, like-minded people. But it didn't take long. All it took was me to see someone, and it was just, I clicked right back in there. So.
So
You
John,
were 17, right?
No, when I first I was 15 when I first
15.
went to juvenile hall.
John, what do you think you're looking for in the questions?
Well, because it seems like he's much more mature than I was.
You mean now? Or then?
Well, I don't know about now, but then.
We're here now,
Yes.
though. How would you have such certainty about then if it doesn't exist, while you have no certainty about now? I mean, think about that just for a second.
Well, no, I'm not saying, well, let me clarify also that nothing is resolved in me, right? So when if you're talking about me at 15 years old, he's still sitting here talking to you.
Yes, and that's why I'm not talking to you at 15 years old. I'm talking to you now.
Right. But
so the question was, what are you doing and looking for the answer? The questions, my sense is questions come from doubt. And if we're doubting what we're thinking and need to answer more questions, we're basically confirming the doubt by trying to look for something we never seem to be able to find. Humans have been seeking throughout human history. Most of the writing that's been done is an attempt to figure out what the hell we're doing here. Well, it's interesting that we've been doing what we've been doing the whole time and can't seem to just mention that, while we're looking for all these esoteric, other worldly views that haven't seemed to answer that question. It hasn't seemed to bring certainty to humanity. And the idea that we're just where we are doing what we're doing right now has always been the case, regardless of what we thought about it. So my question is, if you're asking, what is it you're really looking for?
there's an incredulity to it where I'm
very good.
I'm just,
Very good.
Yeah. So but I'm kind of mesmerized by his experience and in awe of how he could do something that I could not do. There's almost like a competitive notion in my head now that he did something so extraordinary that I know I was incapable of doing at the ages that he talks about it.
So you've got a lot of work left to do.
I told you, nothing is resolved.
Yeah, exactly.
Nothing.
But because the wound is constantly being exposed, constantly being.
Oh yeah, no, there's no scab on it even. It's
exactly. It's just raw.
It's raw, and as I talk about it as like, my insulation on my wires is gone. I have no insulation on my wiring.
Yeah. So that would mean you have created a situation, in my estimation, that's giving you the sensitivity to become aware to things, because the denial that you used to think you were intoxicated or anesthetized to not feel them wasn't in fact true. Just like, David, when you said earlier that you didn't feel fear, my sense is we feel it. We just develop it. We develop our actions to a point where we think we don't, so that we can act without fear interfering, when in fact it's driving us in this sort of subliminal, what we call subconscious way. This is always there. If we're aware of it, where does it go when all of a sudden we do things that are fearful when we think we're not? We've just developed a reputation. We've developed a commitment. We've developed a way of doing things that give us impressions that aren't true, to give us the impression that we're in control, when in fact we're acting out of control by all best guesses and estimates, since we're doing things that are really not helpful to other people and harmful to them. So in that sort of mesmerized state, that trance that we get into, which I would call an addiction, an intoxication with our own ability to think we're not doing what we're doing, we've done that through human history. It isn't surprising to me that it's difficult to talk about in the present, because it isn't something we have any books written on how to do. People have not been talking about this, as far as I can tell, because at any point in history, we're always at the forefront of everything everyone else has done, making believe that nothing's new because we've been talking about it a long time, that anything old isn't actually representing the newness of this moment in all that it encompasses. It's just another story about a culture and a past and a history that we all think we share and that's common, and we kind of just skip along and scrape our feet and think is normal, and it isn't. It's absolutely not normal. It's not invigorated, and it's not inspiring. It's not invigorating, and it's not inspiring. It's lackluster and weighty and conflicted, and we think we need to spend more time alone thinking about it as a solution, when in fact that's the kind of thinking that thinks about it in a way that just continues to complicate it and give us a greater impression that we're out of control, while we're trying to think that we're in control, doing more and more of that thinking. So if the present knowing awareness is an awareness we have, our preoccupation constantly with the thinking that's in doubt would constantly ask questions that we think, once answered, will give us some security. And you're even finding, John, the incredulity of David having done something at a much younger age than you did it. And you can't believe that that could even be possible, given the history. You thought you were doing everything you could possibly do.
Yeah, I think I was pretty clear about that.
Yeah, exactly. But here is something that can't be changed, being thought of in the present as though it can be, by thinking about it differently, or even being surprised that there may have been limits to what you were doing, when in fact, in your thinking, they were unlimited, because you were so fiercely committed to the goals you had and the things you thought you needed to become, in the face of denying who you actually were in the absolute sense of being and nature.
And still,
thank you,
doing that.
Yeah. I mean, think about the word still. It's continuing to remain and still. Perfect peace, like current. Current seems to suggest a flow, but it talks about the current now. It's happening now. What's that flow? Well, it certainly isn't stifled thinking that seems to be blocked, creating blockages in our body that seem to be happening to us rather than created by us.
Yeah, I don't disagree. I don't cognitively disagree with you.
This other awareness, and David, I think you referenced it a little bit earlier, as you have those glimpses that happen that seem to be unplanned for, is actually just witnessing our state of knowing that's always present. It's always been there. And it's a surrender and a concession of what we're doing that eliminates the preoccupation with the conflict. We think we're going to put the fire out by using more gasoline when it comes to thinking about our thinking.
Yeah.
You know, and the fire keeps growing. So we keep adding more and more because we just have a wrong formula for the approach. We've been thinking the thinking will solve it, when it's been the thinking about the thinking that's been creating it the whole time, because we believe in it as true and real. We really think we can create our own reality, when in fact we can manifest all sorts of things that are incredible and may well be beneficial to everyone. And what we largely do is create things that are not particularly beneficial to anyone, and then wonder why we keep doing things that seem to be so unproductive and so useless and so obviously representative is something well less than the potential we have to express an absolute loving, caring source. And I'm not talking about this in trite actions, polite manner. I'm talking about it as actually noticing that if it's actual and it's factual and it's true and it's real, that it's what we already share. It's absolutely what we've always had. It is what we have now. It's actually the only thing we have in the face of making believe all these other thoughts we have are true and real. They can't be. They can be thoughts we're having, certainly. And thoughts can be thoughts. But when I think it's me, I've mistaken. My mistakings are my misgivings. I'm mistaking things. I'm actually a what do they call it? ID theft. I've made believe that who I am is what I think.
Yeah.
And it's a fraud.
Some of the thoughts I speak of are just historical,
Yes.
And to be accurate, shaping the thought and the feeling, not necessarily to where I live through today, but some of them, yeah. And some of these things I'm contrite for, within myself, for myself, But like, as you say, I'm here right now and I'm in the present speaking about these things for an understanding, because I was invited to do that,
Yeah.
So I don't want it to be taken. Like, I know some of the things you say, I don't want it to be taken as if that's where I'm swimming in it, because I'm not.
Well, if we're looking at understanding, the one thing to begin to understand is that the nature of our existence is not based in thinking. Thinking is based in the nature of our existence. So the point I'm making is that most of what these conversations contain is us trying to understand the thinking that got us to the point where we think we need to understand something.
No.
That's just a repetition of new thinking, trying to understand and use reason to come to terms with reality. Intuition, by definition, is knowledge beyond reason, meaning there is no reason in it because there is no thinking in it, and there is no understanding in it because it just knows it knows, and we are aware we are aware.
Yeah, one of the things is just, to be honest, like, I use my hands for a lot of my expressions. I didn't know how to express myself with words, so when I got frustrated, I'd use my hands.
Yeah.
And some of the thinking I do is to remind myself not to do that. So I keep it in the present and saying the reason why it's wrong to do that, because it was done to me.
You don't keep it in the present. You're always in the present. And there's nothing kept in the present because it's an absolute state of being that isn't a dimensional, spatial thing. And the point you made about your fist, David, shows how quickly we act on our thinking and end up expressing those sick thoughts by what we do.
Yes.
And the toxicity of that action isn't limited to the things we do that are the most glaring, any more than drug addiction is limited to the people who are lying in the streets, completely incapable of going to the bathroom in some place that would be considered normal, where they're lying in a gutter, completely soiled and completely. That isn't the addiction is the same as the guy in the, on Wall Street, smoking crack or doing coke in his office to keep himself going. It's the same thing. It doesn't discriminate. There's no inequality in it.
Yeah, I agree.
Insanity. People today are talking about a lack of discrimination. Insanity does not discriminate any more than addiction discriminates. So it's starting to see that we have concepts about what are happening that we really believe are true, which is what we're struggling with. It's the only thing we're struggling with, because there's no struggle in something that's absolute. There is no fight in something that's absolute. There's no proof in something that's absolute. There's no time or space in something that's absolute.
That's why I spoke on classifications earlier.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if we're looking for understanding, if we simply begin to understand that, figuring that if that's the premise of life and existence itself, certainly that would be a primary bit of understanding for a human to have, rather than think the thinking I'm doing needs to be understood to finally get me there, where again, by doing that would make believe that my thinking is primary to life and reality and truth, rather than seeing that my thinking is a byproduct of it. And if the thinking I'm doing doesn't even understand, isn't willing to admit the most fundamental aspect of life and reality and truth and love, certainly I'm never going to go anywhere with the thinking in any other way that's conflicted. And just start to let that shift begin to be seen as something that's always where we are. It's always what we know. It's always who we are. And even thinking about it being who we are is still a question. Who we are is who are we? Rearranged, right? So it's more like it's as we are now, which isn't a question. That we are now, which isn't a question. It's simply a statement of fact that when we align our present experience, which we're always having, with our thinking starts to align immediately because we're aligning it. It's kind of like having a pipe connected to the water and then connecting it to the faucet. If it's not connected to the faucet, you're going to get the water, but it's not going to come through the faucet. And the malign thoughts we have about this in the most fundamental way is what's creating this whole cavalcade of thinking that leads us to think we've got to put all the bits and pieces together, largely of things that aren't happening, only what we're thinking about them in the present is happening, and think someday we'll get it right. Someday they'll tell us the truth. Someday, as though we don't know better, as though it's the story that's going to finally tell us. It's the story is going to finally make us real and true, rather than see it's the story we're telling that keeps us from the experience of reality and truth, while we're actually absolute witnesses of reality and truth.
Yes. Yeah. Well,
so that can sound like a challenge. And in fact, it's the easiest thing to do because it's not something we've ever not done. It's always been our natural state while we've been busy preoccupying ourselves with dysfunctional thoughts and malign thoughts and thoughts that aren't true as true. And we make believe that that becomes who we are and what we are and all we are. And as a result,
I don't really feel challenged though. You know, what I'm saying is like challenged in the negative way or anything like, oh, you're calling me on my bullshit or something like that. I don't feel challenged.
Well, when you approach those thoughts, David, you will feel challenged.
I feel welcomed into have that become something to learn.
Yes.
You know, so I just want to get you to understand that part. Yeah, I'm very, very open to thoughts. Like I have another, like when I say I've written down all these notes and stuff, like I really have them that, you know, from, they say, you know, one of the things I wrote down in the middle of something is like, and don't, it's not a shot. It's just what I wrote. It said, too much listening is pretty much bullshit. Kids need to be taught to express themselves, not become the teacher, you know? And I learned that through some of the trainings that I had, that where everyone was forcing these kids to become the way that they think,
right,
which is flawed, you know, and that's what, you know, I, within myself, you know, I wanted to be better learn to express myself in the thoughts that I say. Like some of the things I say is along the lines of what you said, but I use the wrong word. So it's going to come off the wrong way when I speak. So, but I respect you as the teacher on teaching me these thoughts, but that's not what I'm trying to become, but I just become a better expression of that within myself.
Yes. And
that's why I say I don't feel challenged.
If I have a job, it's to simply allow you to do what you do in the best way you can, not the way I think you should, because my thinking about it is never going to be right. The goal here, if there's a goal, is to talk about an absolute present state of being in the present, so that the premise of thinking can begin to be seen as something that has a stable basis and can easily be stabilized simply by thinking about things accurately in the most fundamental way. The idea that you're not challenged, and I will challenge you on this, David, is to suggest that the thoughts you think you're not thinking, and here's where the real rubber meets the road in this process, and I learned this by realizing that as I got clearer in certain respects, what I got clearer about, at first I thought I was resolved, it was done. And what I got clearer about were things I didn't even think I was thinking. And those became challenges because I kept making believe, because I didn't think I was thinking them, that they weren't happening. And yet they were creating the exact same consequences I used to get from the things I thought I was thinking that were wrong, that I basically, that sort of dissolved. And I realized that there was a whole other element here, and that the ultimate challenge was starting to, rather than look for the cause and claim that I'm not responsible, simply look at the effects and say, if I'm feeling the effects of discouragement, which is a lack, by the way, of courage, right? And disturbance, which certainly isn't comforting. If I start looking at those as my experience and I'm looking at the effects, I know that there is a cause happening in the thoughts to be creating that I am doing. And as I started doing that, those thoughts became more visible to me because I was acting oblivious to them, making believe, because I didn't see them and didn't think they were there, that they weren't there, while they were in fact acting on me the whole time. So the challenge becomes saying, wow, if I'm doing things I don't even think I'm doing, yikes. If all I've been dealing with to this point are the things I think I've been doing, then wow, that's an interesting bit of insight to begin to actually notice that it's what I've been doing that I don't think I'm doing that's primarily been motivating me. And to think I'm not doing it while I'm witnessing all the effects of it would be to pretend that what I need to do is get over the effects and try to feel better than them and get over them, which is common, rather than begin to thank them for giving me the insight, the mirror image of what it is that I'm standing in the image of that mirror to create, what I'm creating by standing in that image that's created. I'm creating that image in the mirror. I'm not a byproduct of it. It's not a byproduct of anything other than what I'm doing, what I'm thinking now, even when I don't think I'm thinking about it.
You know what I've only recently learned is that the beverage program has gotten, getting in touch with the beverage program has gotten me to a place where I realize that there are some other giant addictions.
Yes.
And the beverage program is so simplistic compared to these other addictions that are so sophisticated and embroiled in your system.
You know what the difference is? You know every day if you don't pick up a drink that you've succeeded. When it comes to food and sex and breathing and life, where is that line every day that tells you you've gone over or under, that you have exceeded, that you have done that? Because you're starting to deal with the mental aspect of it, which is as broad as every symptom, every addictive tendency, every impulse, every reaction, every behavior that's based on compulsions, every single one of them, not some of them, because the disease is based in the mind. It's based in this thinking. So you're starting to see the breadth of how pervasive this has become. But I will suggest that it's as simple as beginning to notice that the basis of our existence is simply already fully intact, absolutely at peace, all knowing, all present now, that all those other variations and all those other ideas about all the things we think we need to do and resolve by going deeper and deeper and deeper into them are just another foray into making believe that they actually exist, rather than seeing them as simply delusions and fantasies thought to be real. That's all that they all are. So we can think about the individual things. There's 150 different 12-step programs. We can think about the symptoms, and that's small compared to the actual number of symptoms, because people have various symptoms in their everyday experience that are probably you would never be able to account for, because they're so subtle and so many, and to do it would be useless anyhow. But if we're looking at this as a problem, we can look at all symptoms simultaneously, and we can look at all thinking simultaneously, rather than think it's the thinking we need to systematically go through and get the right words to and all that kind of stuff. When you start watching your words, you'll start seeing that you're saying things that are revealing what you're thinking that you didn't even think you were thinking, when you actually listen to the words you're listening to, and not think of them in a connotation, but just listen to the words.
And I think that the always comes back to me is belief, right?
Yeah.
You know, because belief, and you use make believe a lot. So belief, it's the thing that can make you, wrongly so, feel a certain way.
No, it can't make you. It just simply has you feel what's wrong accurately. And what do we do with what's wrong, John? We think we need to get away from it. We think we need to feel better than it. We think we need to get over it. Isn't it interesting that we would get accurate assessments in our own experience that something's wrong and think the best thing to do is pretend it's right by thinking we can escape it and get away from it? What are we escaping if it's anything more than fantasy masquerading as reality, but the idea that it is true?
Which is a belief.
Well, which is any thought to be real is belief. Any thought to be true is belief. Why? Because belief is essentially, there is no belief in reality and truth because it doesn't need to be believed in to be as it is, because it is what it is, as it is, where it is, how it is, when it is, now, always.
But it alters your reaction.
Yes. Very good. So you're seeing that it's the thinking we're doing that creates that reactiveness. Why would we react if we weren't trying to come up with a defensive posture to react, to defend against, because we have to be chronically ready 24 hours a day to defend against the actual witness of our own experience, to admit we're doing something that's absolutely wrong. And you know why it's absolutely wrong? Because it will never be right and it will never work. The only thing it will do is cause a mess and cause pain and cause depression and cause the interminable number of caustic conditions that we're witnessing as a race and a species. The poison, the corruption, the toxicity, all those things we do are all coming out of that thinking, all of them. And they're all justified because if they weren't, nobody in their right mind would act on them. And that's belief in a nutshell. Belief is an opinion. And again, if we knew it was real, why would we have to believe in it? And yet when people see something, they say, that's unbelievable. And I finally thought, you just saw it happen. What's unbelievable about that? Why
it's like a magic show.
Exactly. But we're showing how thin the veil of the words are. And as a result, thin the veil of the thinking are that we're doing in relation to it. As you begin to look at your words and look at the words you're hearing and hear them as accurate assessments of what's going on, you'll start seeing that we have turned words into things like getting away with something. When it comes to mental problems, we actually get away with it all the time. It goes wherever we go. We don't think.
Yeah, and you know,
we
to
think
his analogy,
away from
David's analogy, you know, I'm in the same water as them, swimming.
Yes, exactly. We all share the same earth. We all share the same gravity. We all share the same air. And we make believe that we're separate and distinct and completely different. We have our own worlds, and we can think that, and that's fine. And when you think it is a fantasy, and it's a fantasy, there's no problem there. There's no conflict. When you think fantasy is reality, that is in fact insanity. And by the way,
well, kids, I got to sign off.
Well,
I
I
was
really
just about to say the same thing.
I appreciate both of your time very much. I love you both. I do this as an opportunity to get better at doing it, not because I'm great at it. That's my job. I just want to be better at it because it's one of the things I found to bring great value to my own experience by watching others' experience get better when it does, and also be able to stand in the face of experience that isn't always feeling better about it, which is part of the job, I guess, or the commitment.
Yes.
I do it because my sense is if love is the nature of existence, we already have a loving source. And if we act that way, it will automatically do for us what we can't do for ourselves, exactly as they describe in sobriety. Because the self we're trying to do it for them doesn't even exist, but the knowing nature of our absolute capital self, whatever that soul, that essence is, would be easy to express if I wasn't busy chronically 24 hours a day trying to think what I thought was true and real, when in fact I can then express truth and reality very naturally when I begin to realize I'm doing this to myself. I'm doing this to a self that doesn't exist. It's delusional to think there's something I'm doing any more than imagining right now in the present that there's something I'm actually doing when in fact I'm just creating an image of something I think I'm doing.
Yeah, and I love and I most importantly respect it. And so, I enjoy being here, conversing with you gentlemen. It's one of those bouts you have where you come out all bruised and battered, but with love, and not actual blows. I can appreciate that and love it so much,
Well, I'm happy to hear Ben say they love each other and not have any of them offended.
I didn't say anything.
I know you mean it.
So the best part of training, I always said, was licking your wounds.
Mm.
You are
That's telling, right?
You are a dog.
That's telling, isn't it?
Yeah.
Licking your wounds. That was the best part of training.
You're either a leech or a dog, I guess, because those are things that I think both of those do to clean wounds.
And the dogs use their tongues for toilet paper.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because they apparently aren't affected by they're cleansing rather than polluting.
Yeah.
I love
Anyway,
you guys, and I
I'm
appreciate
signing
that
off.
you do this. I appreciate
it's
that
been-
you do this greatly. Thank you
It's
very
been
much.
it's been real.
That's for
Bet.
sure. It hasn't been real. It is.
Yes.
See ya.
All righty.
Later.